All right. Thanks for joining the study group today. This one will be fairly quick. It's not a whole lot to cover, but it's like a beginning to look at Jinja 2 templates as part of the study group where we focus on either just general best practice of using Ansible, or if you're like more focused, it's also meant to help prepare for like the Ansible network automation specialist certification. So if you're not aware of that one, if you do look into that one, this type of material is meant to kind of follow that and to build skill sets towards being able to accomplish passing that certification. I passed it a little while ago last year, and it's changing. They're updating it, so I'll be updating material as it's made available, as they're modernizing it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some things, especially if this is your first time attending this. I want to show you where some of the main material is. So in the meetup group, if you join from that way, you'll see that there's some links, and I'll always provide after these sessions in the event page. I'll go back and include links of the video recording, Git repository links, and also links to like study guides and that type of stuff. So there is a study guide. So this one right here is the main study guide for this, that it started in February. So I'll go ahead and grab this link here. This should work for you. Yeah, so let me add this link to the chat in case anyone's joining for the first time. So that's what I have right here. And what I have it pointed to is section 2 has directions for whenever we need to use the Cisco sandboxes. So what I did is I already went and reserved one, so we can move past that part. I'll go ahead and start the lab here in a second, but I just wanted to point that out, that section 2, and you can access this from the table of contents. So anytime you come into this lab guide, you'll see new material added into the table of contents. But the March 17th has the directions for using the DevNet in particular. And February 24th, it also shows you like how to reserve the pods. So you need like if you haven't already done so, you need an account for Cisco DevNet, and it's just a free way of getting a topology in their Cisco Modeling Labs. And the Cisco Modeling Labs is this. So what I'm doing is I'm providing you a repo that you'll clone down, and it has a YAML file that's a topology that is this topology, Ansible4Networking. So I've already imported it into the CML that's a part of a sandbox. So if you go back to the previous directions, it'll show you how to reserve it and set up your account. And then ultimately, you'll run a topology. So this is a topology that we use for the labs. So mine is up and running. And I have access to all of these devices through a VPN. So I'm already connected to the VPN. If you haven't connected to one of these reserve labs at Cisco, they provide you with the VPN credentials. And once you connect, you have the exact same IP addressing every time. So when you look at their lab guide, that's all consistent across any of the pods, and it's permanent. So I'm connecting to here. One thing I will recommend, just a heads up, is that there's not enough RAM to run both of these at the same time. So if you click on dashboard, you want to turn this off. You'll need to turn this one off so that you can stop it from here. And then you'll bring yours into here. So that's a whole process of importing. And you just find the file from the repo that you've already downloaded onto your local system and import it. And then it becomes available to turn it on in your environment, which mine is on. So I already ran this and it's running. So the other side of this is the what they call the dev box is a jump box. So I have a jump box already configured, and that's what these other directions we're referring to. So in order to do that, you clone down my repo and you change directories into it. You have to export your GitLab user because you're going to update all of your configurations in your own GitLab repository. So you create a free account in GitLab, and it has all the details in the study guide, and you use your username. So don't use mine, or you're going to connect or try to connect to my repository, but you're not going to have the token or the password. So you're going to use yours. And the reason why you're using your own is because you can save all of your changes. So as you go through this lab guide, you're going to want to change based off of your progress. So that way you're not starting from scratch every time. You're going to continue on from where you left off. And we build on each lab. So that way your inventory that you create continues to work. All the playbooks that you create continue to work. And as we move forward and look at either today, it's all command line stuff. So Ansible Core Engine, like Ansible-playbook stuff. But sometimes we're using Ansible Navigator, which you'll learn about. And sometimes we're using the Ansible controller, which you saw in the demo earlier. So it just depends on what lab we're using. And if we're using one of the other labs, sometimes you're not connecting to Cisco DevNet. So it will instruct you to connect to a Red Hat lab that gives you access to like an automation controller. So that way you don't have to install your own. So don't worry, like each lab section tells you where you need to be and what you need to do. But for this one, this is the setup for the Cisco DevNet stuff in particular, and it needs to be modified. So I run this make file, and it goes and it changes the version of Ansible and installs a bunch of Python files and some modules and the like. And it creates your, or it doesn't create, but it will change directories into your My Project folder because you're going to clone down yours. Hence the reason why you give your username. So all this is a script that's already in the repo that it asks you to pull down here. So you don't have to worry about any of that. You just run the script, let it run from like 5 to like 8 minutes, depending on how busy their pods are. It could take a little bit longer. I think they throttle the bandwidth. So it'll install these things. And then once it's done, you change directories into My Project. And that's where I am at the moment. So today, if I scroll down here, we have the Jinja 2 information. I should have just clicked up at the table of contents, right? Come on, Tony. It's been a long day. Scroll on up. Kind of like halfway through the lab guide. So here we go. August 8th. Should be August 10th. Well, whatever. I guess because I made it a couple days ago, I used that date. So what we're going to do here is follow through the instructions. If you don't already have an environment, don't worry about it. I'm just going to go through it so I can record it. And then you can come back later and you can reserve those sandboxes at any time and go through this lab guide at your leisure. So we are not in loops. So as I scroll down here, we are here. So we're going to talk about Jinja 2 templates. So Jinja 2 templates used to be used a lot for Ansible automation. But what's happened is over time, the modules and now the collections of modules have more modules that have advanced. So it makes more sense for a lot of the automation that you're working on is better suited to use the resource modules. And that's what I was using. We didn't spend too much time like talking exactly like how the resource module worked, but those give me structured data, and it's a lot easier to manipulate the configurations and to work with those Cisco or other vendor devices. Jinja 2 templates are a bit different in the sense that you have to use like be more familiar with like the native command line, because effectively you're creating a template and then you're going to create a configuration, and then normally you're iterating through a configuration file through the template to actually program the device. So we'll kind of chop that up a bit more here in a second, but effectively, it gives you a way of avoiding like making, individual configurations on each device and using a template that you can pass through the very specific configurations depending on the group or at the host level. So we've talked about variables in the past, but ideally you want to create like groups of the like devices and configurations that make sense for the entire group. You would add them to the group vars. And for configurations that make sense that are very specific to a host, then those would go in the host vars. And those would be good candidates for configuring a particular device so you can create a template. So kind of to walk that back a little bit, I would use resource modules where they are available and the parameters that they support for the particular vendor device and the type of configuration that you're trying to build. But you will run into situations where there's not a resource module. So in that case, you can easily create a template. So instead of creating a template that's like all the configurations of the device, you can use the resource modules and then you can round them out with coverage of templates. And I use templates over the config module. So like the iOS config module is another way of configuring a device using the lines parameter. But that's slow because it has to iterate through each line. And you'll see if you have a large configuration, it's going to take quite a bit of time. And depending on how many devices you're running against that particular playbook in your inventory, then it really could take a long time iterating through lines of configs, where the Jinja 2 template would be much quicker in that regard. So the resource modules perform very quickly because it's structured data. Jinja 2 templates would be number 2. And then as a workaround, like maybe if you just have like a one-off type of config that you really don't want to build templates for, then that's where the iOS config module works a bit better. You still would use the iOS config module to launch your template. So we'll see that here in a moment as well. But before we get there, what I have to do is some things to get my environment ready. So I'm going to pull out this lab guide, and I'm going to move it over to the side. Click in here so we can see most of it. Or how do I get rid of this altogether? I thought I could hide that. Move this over a little bit more. That should be good like that. And then I'm just going to use like a tab to connect to the devices or connect to that the dev box. So I can use SSH from my browser or from the terminal. So again, I have the VPN. So it's always the username developer at 10.10.20.50 is their jump box, or what they call their dev box in the Cisco sandbox. And the password's always capital C1SCO12345. Then you can see that I already have on my project. I went through all those steps previous. CD, my project. Then I have all these previous files that I saved. It's always important to save all this stuff at the end of working with your lab, and I'll do that to mine as well. So the first thing I want to do is create that directory. So we can see everything. I'll go ahead and move this over to the right, and I'll go ahead and make that directory templates. All right, and I'll go ahead and change directories into it. And then what I want to do is create a Jinja 2 file. All right, so this is a Jinja 2 file. I'll explain it here in a second. So I use Vim. You could use Nano. You could also get your VS Code through the SSH tunnel if you prefer using it that way. Sometimes I do that. We could have a session where I could show you how to do that, but it takes a few minutes the first time to set it up and all that. But I just use Vim to keep it simple. mgmt.j2 for a Jinja 2 file. So I can insert. And I'm just going to copy this out to save time. All right, so this is a Jinja 2 template. What's important for the template, there is a couple of rules here to follow. Indentation is based off of the native configuration. So the running configuration in this case, because it's Cisco. And you can see that most of these configurations are to the left because they're at the config T, the first level of the config. But some of them, or this one is nested, right? So if you go into an interface, if you look at the running config, then the interface configurations are indented. So you have to follow that exact syntax or it'll fail when you're running the Jinja 2 template and pushing that configuration into the device. It does matter. Syntax does matter on the command line side. So that's why the resource modules are actually more abstracted. So I kind of prefer them. You don't have to know as much about the command line. With Jinja 2, you do need to be aware of the command line. So there's that, right? So the other thing is some of the things you can do in a Jinja 2 template. So one of those is you have the ability to use loops, right? So that's what this is. This for name server in name servers, right? So name server is like the placeholder or the iterator that we're naming, like in our Jinja 2 template, and in name server. So where is name servers at? Right. So the same thing with these variables. So notice the double curly braces. That's the Jinja 2 variable syntax that we use in a playbook, right? So we use them here. The only difference is we don't have to quote them. In the playbook, we do have to quote them. But here we don't. But it's still the same thing. These are just variable placeholders. So these variables need to live somewhere, right? So we're going to work on that in a second. So these haven't been defined yet. So what we're doing is we have, you know, these placeholders at this point. So one thing you'll notice is if I open like a loop in this case, I have to end it. So this is the opening. So for name server in name server. So it's going to iterate through more than one name server. So just like in the demonstration earlier, I had 2 name servers. So I had a list of name servers. It's the same thing here. I have 2 name servers. So I'm going to iterate through 2 of them. So I have more than one, then I need a loop in my template. But then I would terminate it here with N4. We also have ifs and end ifs, right? So you have conditions that you can use in a Jinja 2 template. I don't have any conditions in this one, but I do have that loop. And then you'll notice that it's more holders for variables. And then this one is a little bit different. This one here with the pipe is a filter. So let me scroll over so you can see that a bit better. This filter is the IP adder filter. And you'll notice that I have what we call a fully qualified collection name here. So it's Ansible.utils. And remember, I had utils.validate. So that same collection that has the validate that we used to validate like our OSPF neighbors as one of the health checks that we had, validation checks that we had in the previous demo. This one is for IP addressing. So this filter is the netadder Python module. And what it does is if I want to work with something like an access list, I may or may not want the mask. So in this particular case, I can use this filter to provide the mask in a format that the access list can understand. And in the variable, I think it's like I have like the slash, whatever the subnet is for these devices /32, for that host address. And then we're going to turn it into a format that the access list will like. So I'm using this filter. It just makes things easier. Most filters just make whatever we're doing in Ansible easier. And there's all sorts of different filters for different reasons. And we will have a section just on filters. So another filter that I like to use is the one to turn to nice YAML. So we usually start with JSON output. And I kept it JSON in the demo, but I could have turned it into a YAML format using a filter. And again, there's all sorts of filters, so that like warrants its own session. So this is just a filter to manipulate the subnet mask or the mask of the host that we're adding into this access list. So all of this is like management stuff, management configurations for the device. And we're just running this template to add them in because there may not be like a resource manager or resource module rather for all of these. Most of these are actually so they're not the best candidates here because we do have like the NTP server one and so on. But for things that are like one-offs, then, if we could create a template and stuff that's just not covered. So here's the template. So I need to save this. So we have a template. So now the variables, I need to define these variables. So the question is where do I want to define them? Well, a lot of these variables are the same for all of my devices in my topology. And if you look at my topology back here, let me make this larger. You'll notice I have some switches here. So this is Nexus. And these are CSR 1000Vs that use iOS XE, right? So these have a common operating system. And this is different, right? So even some of their command lines are different as well, right? So there are nuances. Even though they're both Cisco, there's some nuances here. But if the configuration makes sense, right, even if the syntax is a bit different, but if the variable makes sense to use across these, then why not put it in a group that would apply to both of these? So that's what we're doing. So we're like these variables could be used as a config in these, but then we would also want to be careful because we want to make sure that we're using the correct modules because of the differences in syntax. So even though they're using the same NTP server, the way that we apply the NTP configuration is a bit different depending on if it is iOS XE or if it's Nexus OS. Right, and you'll see this over and over again, these nuances. So what I want to do here is I'm going to apply it to this group in my inventory, this A for N-net. So just again, just another quick recap. I do have an inventory already in here. Let me go back. Right, so I have an inventory file in here, right here, inventory.yaml. It has all these different groups and parent and child groups. And you're really going to have to build this skill set where you learn how to add hosts to groups and then groups as children to other groups. So parent groups to children groups, host to groups, right? And these groups become children to other groups. So this A for N network has A for N routers and A for N switches. And the A for N is just an acronym for the Ansible for networking, right? So I created these groups. So for these common configurations, I'm going to put them in the A for N net group vars. So I'm going to have to open that up. So I'll go to group vars that I created in a previous lab, and it is A for N network, and then vars.yaml. You notice I have something already in here, right, for the connections. So this is the network underscore CLI connection type because Cisco sends command line automation over that SSH connection. That's the serialized data sent from Ansible to the device. So we don't interact with command line, but the command lines are what is being sent on the wire to the device in that SSH connection. So I want to keep that. I need that. So go ahead and fix that. I just almost had a foobar there, right? So we'll go ahead and paste these guys in. All right, so these all would work on any of the devices. It all makes sense. Save that. Now this config here is only relevant to iOS. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add that to just the routers because the routers are using iOS. So I just need to change this. Right, and then Ansible underscore network underscore OS is a magic variable for the OS type, right? For that particular device, it's iOS. Then we'll add this. So the logging level will be 6 for syslogs. Escape. All right, so we've saved that. Now we want to create a playbook. So this is how we can use a template in our playbook. So I mentioned one of the ways to implement a Jinja 2 template is through the config module. So each one of the vendors in their OS have a config module. So iOS underscore config, there's also iOS XR underscore config, Nexus OS underscore config, EOS underscore config, Junos underscore config, and so on and so forth, right? So all the vendors that have collections provide those modules. So the source, all this is where the Jinja 2 template is. So it's going to push whatever config, populates the variables in that template, and then that config is pushed into the device using this config module. So the source, we have to define where it is. So I created this variable here that points to what we created, the templates folder, and we called it mgmt.j2, right? So that's where it is. So this condition down here says only use this when the Ansible underscore network OS is iOS. So it's not going to configure the Nexus. It's going to skip those. Those configurations would work, but we would want to provide another line down here that would be Nexus OS underscore config, right? Because the Nexus won't work if we push it using the iOS. So we want to create a condition in this case to say only change the iOS. But even though it's going to grab those variables from the A for N network group vars, and then we're using that as the group that we're pointing to in this playbook. So even though the switches are there, it's not going to run automation against those switches. It'll skip those because of the conditional. And conditionals are something that's very important as well. That you'll see that in reoccurring labs all the time. So we're going to call this playbook what are we calling this project? Playbook is called create a play. Oh, management.yaml. Okay. Hi. All right, make sure everything looks aligned properly. If your syntax is messed up, that's a problem. Save it. All right, so now I have a playbook. So I can run my playbook. I already have a config file, ansible.cfg, that points to where my inventory is, so I don't have to explicitly tell it the inventory.yaml. So I'll run just the playbook, mgmt.yaml. You'll notice it skipped the 2 because of the condition. And now it's kind of hung on the 1, so I'm wondering if there's a problem connecting or something. One thing I'll do is just, since this has been running a while, make sure everything's green, which it is. Oops. Yeah, I'm still connected. And so what happened here? All right, so let me see if I can connect to these guys. Cisco at 10.10.20.173. Yep. All right, let's look into that playbook. MGMT host A4N net. All right, and let me try it again. Just make sure it wasn't some one-time thing. Yeah, weird, huh? So sometimes the sandbox is flaky like that, so it makes sense to rerun it again. But you can see this time it changed, right? It only changed for the core router and dist router 1 and 2. And then it skipped switch 1 and switch 2. So the last thing that we wanted to do here is just check our work. So how do we check our work? Obviously, we could go directly into those devices and look. But what I want to do is a playbook that will validate all those same parameters that we configured through the template. So I'm going to create that one, and I'm going to call it check management. YAML. All right. So we're going to look at the host name, domain name, the name servers, service timestamps, pretty much everything that you saw in that template. This is a check against that, and also the access list that we created, make sure that it's applied to Gigabit 1 interface on the devices. And then we're going to print it out on the screen. So that should be good. Everything you do, you should check it, validate it. Skip the switches again because we obviously didn't change them. Right, and here's all the output. Right, so we can see the host name of each one. The domain name is Ansible4Networking.com. The name servers to Google on each one. The timestamps for the logging. Right, so it's just each one of these is an output of a typical show command to validate that configuration for all of the devices except for the switches. So here's the thing about save your work. So I'm going to do that real quick because I'm done this section. So if you don't do these two, you will have like a little error message, a warning. So it's better to do this just so you don't see that, but it will work without it usually. So I'm gonna go ahead and avoid that just to save a couple seconds. So Git add all, will add all of the changes that I made. Or I could do it per file. So I'm just adding them, or what they call staging those files. So let me show you before I do that, just real quick. Git status. Right, it shows you all these untracked files. Right, this is what I created right earlier. So when I add them, it stages them. It adds them into Git, but they haven't been. They have at that point they haven't been committed yet. So Git add slash all. Now, if I'm done with everything, I can commit it. That says that I'm done. This is the final copy of those. Commit dash M and then give it a message so I know. So today was aug 10. Right. So this is all local. It's still committed into a repo, but this is the local repo that's running in the DevNet sandbox. Is that where I want it to stay? No, because this is going to go away once my time limit expires. So I want to push it to my GitLab. Right. So it gave me those warning messages, but what it really cares about is, okay, what is your username? Right. And then your password. Right. Now it would update my project that is on GitLab. So the next time that I clone it down, it will have all my changes. So just don't forget to do that as you're working through this lab guide. Wherever you stop, you don't have to stop like right at the end of a section. Just make sure you save those, and then you can go back and start over where you left off. So again, thanks for staying on, and I went over on time and everything, but I'm glad a few of you stayed on. I recorded it for those who couldn't stay on, and feel free to go to the YouTube channel. You can go back in time if you want to see any of the past recordings of any of the other previous study labs. And then the study guide goes back in time as well. And you'll see more and more labs added every week. I try to add a section or two to kind of get. I'm actually kind of fell behind, so I need to get ahead again. So you'll see new labs being added. So feel free to go ahead if you'd like as well. And if you have questions, you can hit me up on the Discord channel, or if you have anything, you can bring it up on any of these meetups, as well as on LinkedIn. There's a newsletter that I send out. You can interact with me there as well. So the newsletter will have like Red Hat Ansible updates and news, and some. I also provide some tutorials, like sample code types of things. So thanks for joining, and I hope I answered all the questions. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I think we're okay on that side of things. And have a great rest of your day. Take care, everybody.